Welcome to the Behind Closed Doors channel. Wishing you a peaceful day. Today, I'd like to share the following story with you. I hope you enjoy listening to my story. Now, please.
She gave birth alone. Then he called to invite her to his wedding. A story about the love that arrived too late, the woman who survived without it, and the single phone call that broke everything open again. Part 1. The phone call. The baby had finally fallen asleep. That alone felt like a small miracle, the kind of miracle that only new mothers understand, the kind that has nothing to do with faith and everything to do with 47 minutes of rocking, humming, and holding your breath. Vivian Foe lay perfectly still in the center of the VIP hospital bed, her right arm numb from the shoulder down, her left hand threaded with an IV needle that stabbed a little every time she so much as exhaled. The cesarean incision below her abdomen had settled into a low, insistent throb, not quite pain, not quite numbness, but something in between that reminded her with every heartbeat, you were cut open 12 hours ago. You are not fine. You are never going to admit that. The room was expensive and quiet. A humidifier murmured in the corner. The heating system breathed through vents she couldn't see. Her newborn daughter lay across her chest in that boneless, liquid way that only newborns can manage, her tiny mouth forming little suckling shapes, even in sleep, her brow creasing and smoothing and creasing again, as if she were dreaming of something urgent she couldn't quite articulate. Then the phone buzzed. The first time, she ignored it. The second time, she made a decision that it could keep waiting. The third time, gaping at her from the bedside table with the blue-white persistence of a small, impatient star, she finally tilted her head and read the screen. Ethan Nguyen. Not Ethan. Not ex-husband, not even the little skull and crossbones emoji she'd briefly considered before deciding it was beneath her. Just Ethan Nguyen, his full name, formal, stripped of intimacy, because she'd changed the contact 6 months ago and told herself it was tidiness, not grief. 6 months of silence. 6 months during which she had grown a human being inside her body, watched her ankles swell into a stranger's ankles, attended every prenatal appointment alone, signed every form alone, and lay awake in the dark alone, rehearsing the version of herself who was going to be fine with all of it. 6 months, and now 3 missed call notifications in a row. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. Hello? Her voice came out rougher than she intended, the particular hoarseness of someone who has spent the last 12 hours alternating between holding silent screams and breathing through pain. She layered it with a practiced unconcern, as if she'd simply been napping, as if he might not notice. A pause on the other end. She could hear the specific quality of a person gathering themselves. Then, Vivian. Her full name, both syllables. He said it the way someone says a word they've been thinking about for longer than they want to admit, carefully, with a kind of reluctant precision. I'm getting married in a few days. Another pause. I wanted to know if you'd come. The room did something strange. The humidifier kept humming. Her newborn daughter kept sleeping. The IV drip kept dripping. Everything maintained its ordinary rhythm, while the air itself seemed to thicken, to turn a different color, to rearrange itself around a sentence that Vivian's brain recognized, but couldn't quite absorb.
He's getting married.
He's getting married in a few days. He called to invite you. She registered somewhere in the back of her mind that she was supposed to feel something large right now. Betrayal, maybe, or grief, or one of those specific species of humiliation that only comes with being handed a wedding invitation by someone who once promised you things in front of witnesses. What she actually felt, holding her sleeping daughter against her chest, was something closer to disbelief at the absurdity of the moment. It arrived in her chest not as pain, but a kind of startled, involuntary dark humor. The universe's timing had always been lousy, but this was almost impressively bad. "Congratulations," she said, and her voice, somehow, astonishingly, came out steady. Slightly husky, yes, slightly worn at the edges, but steady. "I'm afraid I'm in bed and can't get up." A beat. "Are you okay?" Something in the way he asked it, too quickly, fractionally less composed than the rest of his speech, told her he'd been expecting almost anything except what she'd said. "I just gave birth," Vivian said, very simply. "I'm in the postpartum recovery period." The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever heard. She would think later about all the things that silence contained. She had spent 6 months constructing a life around a single enormous secret. Not the secret of her pregnancy. She had told her best friend, Lydia Lynn, almost immediately, in a bathroom stall at a coffee shop, clutching a positive test and laughing in a way that was very close to crying. The secret was the person who didn't know. The person she had decided, with the kind of clear-eyed resolve that feels like bravery and sometimes is, simply would not be told. She had good reasons. She told them to herself every night, a kind of private rosary. The divorce was finalized. The relationship was over. The child had been conceived before she knew she was pregnant, in the last weeks of a marriage that had already been dying for years. She had not deceived anyone. She did not owe anyone anything. A woman could choose to raise her child alone. Women did it every day. All of this was true. It was also true that her ankles were so swollen in the final trimester that she couldn't fit into any shoes she owned, that she'd bought maternity clothes alone, standing in the dressing room with her enormous belly and her phone propped against the mirror to video call Lydia for opinions, that she attended 6 prenatal checkups alone, each time reaching the line on the intake form that said accompanying family member and leaving it blank, which never felt like a paper cut that refused to heal. And it was true that the night before the cesarean, when she'd been told the baby was breech and a vaginal delivery was no longer safe, she had lain in a hospital bed exactly like this one and thought with sudden clarifying terror, "I am going to be cut open tomorrow, and there is no one here." She'd called Lydia, who stayed on video call for 4 hours until Vivian finally fell asleep. It helped. It was not the same as not being alone. Now, in the silence on the phone, she could feel the architecture of everything she had carried rearranging itself, making room for the possibility that someone else was about to know. "You just..." Ethan's voice cut off. Her heard him inhale sharply. "You just gave birth?" "Yes." "When?" "Yesterday." Another silence. This one had a different quality, tighter, with something moving fast underneath it. "Vivian." His voice had gone very quiet. "What are you not telling me?" She looked at her daughter's face. the crease between those tiny eyebrows, the precise architecture of a nose that she, in 12 hours of looking, had already recognized as belonging to someone else. "Everything," she said, because it was both the most and least honest answer available. She did not expect him to come. That was the thing she would replay afterward, in the slow, exhausted hours of the days that followed. She genuinely had not expected it. She knew Ethan Nguyen. She had been married to him for 3 years. She knew his rhythms and his silences and the particular way he moved through problems, methodically, from a controlled distance, as if emotion were a variable to be managed rather than a thing to be felt. She knew that he was getting married in a few days, which meant he had a fiancée and a venue and a guest list that probably didn't include his ex-wife, who had just revealed she'd been hiding a pregnancy for 6 months. She expected a long silence, and then perhaps a text, and then, in a few days, some kind of formal correspondence via lawyers. What she did not expect was the sound 40 minutes later of a door being kicked open. The impact was violent enough for her to flinch, to make her daughter startle awake with a sharp, indignant cry. The door rebounded off the wall and swung back, and Ethan Nguyen was standing in the frame, and he was wearing a black formal suit, not a tuxedo, but the kind of structured, immaculate thing that gets worn to important events, and his hair, which was always precisely arranged, had been partially destroyed by wind and speed, and was sticking to his forehead in a way she had never seen before. His face was the color of copy paper. He was looking at the bundle in her arms. She had married this man. She had watched him close deals that other men had spent years chasing. She had seen him move through a room of people who wanted things from him with a kind of glacial, impenetrable calm that she had once found beautiful and later found suffocating. She had watched him sign their divorce papers with the same stillness he brought to everything, methodical, controlled, unreadable. She had never seen him look like this, like something had cracked, like the crack was going all the way down. He crossed the room in 5 long strides and stood at her bedside, and the cold air from the hallway came with him, and he smelled of cedar and winter and something she couldn't name, some note underneath the familiar cologne that was stress, she thought, or maybe just the smell of a controlled person losing control. He was very close. She could see the red threads in his eyes, the way his jaw had gone rigid, the bloodlessness of his lips. His gaze dropped at the baby. It stayed there. "Vivian." His voice was destroyed. It came out low and rough, as if it had been dragged through something sharp. "What are you hiding from me?" She had prepared for this. She had spent 6 months preparing for this, or something like it, the inevitable moment of confrontation, the accounting she'd known was coming. She'd had arguments with him in her head, in the shower, in the grocery store, during prenatal yoga, articulate and calm and devastating. She knew what she wanted to say. What she actually said, meeting his eyes and not looking away, was, "What does it have to do with you?" He repeated it back to her as if she'd said something in a language he was still processing. Then his voice split open. "Vivian, whose child is this?" And he reached for the baby. "Don't touch her." The sound that came out of her own mouth surprised her. It was not a word so much as an animal response, something that bypassed the brain entirely and came from the place where all human decisions about protecting small, helpless things are made. She curled around her daughter, arms crossed over the bundle, and the movement pulled the surgical incision and turned her vision briefly gray, and she didn't care, would do it again without a second's hesitation.
Ethan's hand stopped. He was close enough that his fingers had almost grazed the soft fleece of the blanket. He stood there with his arm extended, and then something happened in his face that she had no name for. The fury draining so quickly, as if almost frightening, replaced by something hollow, something bewildered, and he went still.
And then the baby, apparently having decided she'd been patient long enough with this entire situation, opened her mouth and screamed. There is a specific quality to a newborn's cry that is designed by evolution to be impossible to ignore. It bypasses rational thought. It reaches something older and more basic, some wiring that predates language and culture and the careful management of human emotion. It is not loud so much as penetrating. It is, in the most literal sense, a demand. The blanket had been jostled loose. A small face was now visible, red and indignant and scrunched into an expression of profound displeasure, the eyes still shut, the mouth a perfect circle of outrage. Ethan Nguyen looked at that face. He stood there with his arms still half extended, and he looked at his daughter's face. And what happened in his expression in the next 4 seconds was something Vivian would spend a long time thinking about. The fury, the disbelief, the calculation that was always present somewhere behind his eyes, already trying to assess and manage and contain. All of it was there, and then, very slowly, very completely, all of it was dissolved by the face of a 12-hour-old person who had his exact eyebrows and his chin and his infuriating characteristic expression of displeasure that refuses to be ignored. He lowered his arm. He stepped back. The baby kept screaming, righteous and absolute. And Vivian, who had held herself together through 6 months of pregnancy, through a night alone before surgery, through 12 hours of labor and delivery, and the specific horror of being stitched back together while conscious, who had not cried once in front of anyone because crying felt like conceding something she couldn't afford to concede, felt something finally, completely give way. Not loudly, not with the drama the moment arguably deserved, just silently, her shoulders beginning to shake and tears tracking down her face and falling on the blanket, and the specific, devastating exhaustion of a person who has been holding themselves together for too long, finally finding they simply cannot do it for 1 more second. She held her daughter and wept, and did not make a sound. Ethan stood there and watched her. And the wedding he was supposed to be having in 4 days, the venue, the guests, the carefully selected rings, the fiancé who was probably wondering where he'd gone, felt in that moment like something that had happened to someone else entirely. Part 2. The Reckoning. The hospital discharged Vivian and the baby 3 days after the phone call. Those 3 days were not peaceful. They had the particular texture of a natural disaster in its aftermath. The wind had stopped, the obvious destruction was visible, but no one had yet determined the full extent of what had broken. The staff moved around her with exaggerated gentleness. She caught fragments of conversation in the hallway, General Manager Nguyen and the baby, and called off the wedding, scattered words that she collected without intending to, and then carefully chose not to think about. On the second day, a man in a white coat arrived whom she'd never seen before, mid-50s, formal, accompanied by a young assistant carrying a portfolio. The assistant presented documents with the particular smooth professionalism of someone trained to make unpleasant things seem routine. On behalf of the Nguyen family, we'd like to arrange some comprehensive health screenings for the infant, standard genetics, early development panels.
"Paternity testing," Vivian said. The assistant's smile didn't waver. "We simply want to ensure." "Genetics," she said. "You can stop there." She read every document. She asked every question. She made them specify in writing that she would receive copies of all results, and no medical procedure on her daughter would proceed without her explicit consent. The assistant's professional smile remained intact throughout, though it acquired a slight stiffness around the edges. She agreed in the end because she knew the result, because refusing felt like having something to hide, and she had nothing to hide, and because the baby was Ethan Nguyen's daughter in a way that was not going to stop being true simply because Vivian found it convenient. What she did not agree to was any of the rest of it. On the fourth day, she woke at 4:30 a.m. and began to move. The plan was Lydia's, or rather, the logistics were Lydia's, which was the best kind of plan, because Lydia Ling had been Vivian's closest friend since university and was also a family attorney who thought in contingencies and had a client who owned a private postnatal care facility in the city's quieter outskirts. "Near the mountain and the lake," Lydia said. "Private security, very discreet clientele. Your ex-husband will know you're there within 48 hours if he's determined, but he can't just walk in. That's 48 hours you don't have right now." She packed light, one rolling suitcase, the essentials, the things that were genuinely irreplaceable, documents, medication schedule, the small bear that Lydia had left in the room the day the baby was born. She waited until the shift change, when the hallways were briefly unmanned, and she eased herself out of bed with the careful, controlled movements of someone who has learned that if she favors the left side and breathes deliberately and doesn't think about how much it hurts, she can almost walk normally. The corridor was white and empty. Her footsteps were soft on the linoleum. She took the fire stairs because the cameras had eyes, and she went down 2 floors to a service corridor, and she was almost at the rear exit when she nearly collided with a cleaning attendant pushing a cart. The woman looked at Vivian, then at the bundled baby, then at the suitcase. "Oh, you're one of the mothers. Where are you going this early, dear? You shouldn't be walking alone." Vivian said, her voice, she was pleased to hear, steady. The attendant looked at the empty hallway behind her. "Let me call a nurse. It's fine, really, they're right there. Thank you so much." She did not run. Running would have been both impossible and conspicuous. She walked very quickly, the suitcase wheel catching slightly on a tile, her heart making a considerable amount of noise in her chest, until she pushed the heavy service exit door and the cold air hit her, and she saw Lydia's gray sedan idling in the alley, with Lydia herself already opening the driver's door. The headlights came on. Not Lydia's headlights, other headlights from behind, flooding the alley with white light that made Vivian instinctively turn away and shield the baby's face. The sound of a powerful engine, idling low and deliberate. A black Bentley, its presence in the service alley of a hospital, both completely absurd and completely characteristic. The driver's door opened. Polished shoes on wet pavement, the sound of a long, unhurried stride. Ethan Nguyen walked into the headlight glare. He was wearing dark trousers and a gray wool coat, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt open. And this, Vivian registered with a distant surprise, was the most disheveled she had ever seen him outside of sleep. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. He looked like someone who had made very important decisions very recently and was still carrying the weight of them. He looked, she thought, like a person who had not slept. He stopped with the Bentley angled across the alley in a way that blocked Lydia's car without touching it. He looked at Lydia, one long, expressionless assessment. Then he looked at Vivian. "Vivian, His voice was different. She'd known his voice for 4 years, through courtship and marriage and divorce, and this version of it, lower with an edge of hoarseness, something constrained, was new. "Where are you taking my daughter?" Lydia stepped in front of Vivian immediately, with the reflexive protectiveness of someone who has spent 4 years watching her best friend make herself smaller in the presence of this particular man. "Move the car, Ethan. She just had surgery. She needs rest and space, not—" "I have the paternity results," he said, speaking past Lydia to Vivian. "I know exactly what they say. I've known what they'd say for 9 months. Then you know that legally—" "Don't." Something shifted in her voice, not louder, but colder. "Don't stand in front of me at 5 a.m. and cite legal frameworks. You called me 4 days ago to invite me to your wedding. You were about to marry someone else, and now you're standing in this alley telling me about legal frameworks. Don't." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Even the Bentley seemed to hold its breath. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had shifted in his expression, the combative edge gone, replaced by a kind of exhausted, deliberate stillness. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I'm here because it's cold, because she's 4 days old, and the air is cold, and she shouldn't be outside in a service alley while her parents have a standoff." He opened the rear door of the Bentley. "There's a house, my property, quiet, private, on a street with trees. No one will bother you there. I have my own arrangements." "I know. Lydia's client's facility." He said it calmly. "I know where it is." Of course he did. "I know you want to go somewhere I can't find you. I understand why, and I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not here to trap you. I'm here because the alternative is watching you stand in the cold at 5 a.m. with a surgical incision that's barely a week old, and I can't—" He didn't finish the sentence.
The baby made a sound, a small, sleepy, indeterminate sound, the kind that means nothing specific and everything at once. Vivian felt her stir, felt the familiar shift of weight and warmth. She looked at Lydia. Lydia's expression said very clearly, "This is a terrible idea," and then a fraction of a second later, "But she's so cold." Vivian looked at Ethan Nguyen and thought about the 4 days since the phone call, about the way he'd stood in her hospital room with his suit jacket trailing snow and his face completely dismantled, about the silence that had followed the baby's first cry, that bottomless, involuntary silence. "Vi," she said quietly to Lydia, "go home. I'll call you." "Vivian." "I'll call you," she said again, "multiple times a day. If I don't, you have my permission to make a scene." Lydia stared at her for 3 long seconds. Then she looked at Ethan with an expression that clearly communicated, "I am a lawyer, and I have excellent memory, and if you hurt her, I will make your life extraordinarily difficult." Ethan held her gaze without flinching. He'd always been good at that. Vivian angled herself carefully into the back seat of the Bentley, moving in that deliberate pain management way she'd perfected. The door closed. The warmth enveloped her, leather and cedar, and the particular brand of expensive, controlled quiet that had once been the atmosphere of her daily life. Ethan got in the other side. He didn't look at her. He said, "Drive," in the direction of the front seat, and the car moved. The house was small by his standards, 3 floors, ivy-covered brick, a garden that had been tended with care, on a street lined with plane trees. Inside, clean angles, white walls, the kind of emptiness that comes from a space that is rarely actually lived in. But someone had prepared it. There was a crib in the upstairs bedroom, new and white. There were nursing pads in the bathroom, and the right brand of infant formula on the counter, and a stack of maternity-appropriate sleepwear hanging in the closet, all in her size. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a long moment, cataloguing it.
"You had 12 hours," she said. "Less," he said from behind her. "I knew what size you wore. I approximated the rest." She turned to look at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching her assess the room, and his expression was, for the first time in her memory, something close to uncertain. "What do you want, honestly?" He looked at the crib. He looked at the baby asleep against her chest. He looked finally at Vivian. "I want to know what I missed," he said. "I want to—" A pause. The muscle in his jaw worked. "She's 4 days old, Vivian. She's been existing for 4 days, and she's going to keep existing, and I—" He stopped again. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and it sounded like it cost him something to admit it. "I don't know how to be useful in this specific situation, but I'm asking you to let me try." It was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing he'd said to her in 4 years. "There's a crib," she said. "Yes." "Formula on the counter." "Yes." "I'm not forgiving you for anything. I'm not asking you to." She walked past him to the crib and laid the baby down, watching the small face settle back into sleep, and she did not say anything else, and he did not say anything else, and the plane trees outside moved in the early morning wind. What followed was something she hadn't prepared for, because she'd been so focused on what she was afraid Ethan might do that she hadn't given much thought to what he actually might do. He stayed, and he was, genuinely, earnestly, sometimes almost comically, useless. On the second morning, she came downstairs to find him standing at the stove in an apron that had a cartoon egg on it, source unknown, squinting at his phone with the focused intensity he usually reserved for quarterly reports. 2 eggs lay cremated on the counter. A third was in the pan, the edges already blackening, the yolk still raw. He turned when she heard her. There were patches of flour on his sleeve. His hair, disheveled from sleep and effort, had not been corrected. He looked at her with the expression of a person who had been hoping to have this conversation at a different time. "Good morning," he said, with the dignity of a man standing in an apron next to 2 dead eggs. "What happened?" "I was attempting to the eggs. They sustained casualties." She reached past him and turned the flame down and took the spatula from his hand. "Too much heat," she said, "and not enough oil." She cracked a new egg into a clean pan and showed him, not because she wanted to exactly, but because the baby was going to be awake soon and they were going to need food, and she was too tired to perform righteous distance about it. He stood behind her and watched without speaking. Then she slid the eggs onto a plate and held it out to him, and he took it and looked at it for a long time. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. They ate at the small kitchen table, the baby monitor between them, and neither of them said anything else. He learned quickly. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. Ethan Wynne had always learned quickly, this habit of treating everything as a problem to be solved through sufficient application of intelligence. He approached fatherhood the same way, and the results were sometimes maddening and sometimes unexpectedly moving. He bought every infant development book available in print. He read them with the same rigor he applied to contract analysis, underlining, margin notes, sticky tabs. He downloaded white noise apps, classical music collections, 3 different tracking apps for feeding and sleeping and diaper changes. When the baby fussed, he didn't hand her back immediately. He would hold her, stiff at first, then gradually relaxing into something more natural, and try different methods from whatever he'd read most recently, rotating through them with the patient determination of someone who absolutely refuses to accept that there might not be a correct procedure. She watched him the first time he successfully soothed the baby using a specific hold he'd learned from a video tutorial. the baby quieting against his chest, his body gradually unhunching, his expression moving from intense concentration to something startled and almost private, as if he wasn't sure he was supposed to feel what he was currently feeling. He didn't know she was watching. He just stood there in the afternoon light, holding his daughter, and his face was completely unguarded in a way she'd never seen before, and she had to look away because something in her chest was doing something she needed to examine later in private. The notebook she found by accident on the third week. It was on his desk in the makeshift office, left open when he'd been called to an emergency video call. A leather-bound journal that she'd assumed was work-related until she glanced at the page and saw Day 22, weight approximately 5.1 kilograms, tracked her watching the mobile for 45 seconds before losing interest, new record. She cried at the 2 a.m. feed, and V had already been up twice. I tried the side-lying position from the book. She stopped crying after 4 minutes. I don't know if I did it correctly or if she just got tired. Need to replicate to confirm. Her eyes are getting darker. She looks more like V every day. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a very good thing. Vivian set the notebook down carefully and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while, looking at the plane trees. The fever arrived without warning, the way fevers in newborns always do. A sudden radiating heat from a body that had been fine 30 minutes earlier, a cry that sounded different, a face that was wrong in a way that bypassed all rational thought and went straight to the primitive alarm system at the base of the brain. Ethan! She didn't plan to say his name. She just said it, loud, because she was holding a burning baby and her hands had gone cold, and she just needed someone else to be there. He came down the stairs in 4 seconds. He looked at her face, then at the baby, and the laptop he was carrying got placed on the nearest surface with a precision that had no wasted motion. He closed the distance between them. What? She's burning up, 38.7. He looked at the thermometer she held out. His expression shifted, not to panic, but to the other thing, the colder thing, the controlled recognition of a problem that requires immediate solution. Coat, he said. He was already moving to the closet. He drove. She hadn't known he would. She'd assumed the driver, but he sat in the front and didn't explain, and navigated the evening traffic at a speed that made her grateful for both the engineering of German automobiles and the fact that there were seatbelts. She watched his hands on the wheel, steady and precise, and then she watched his face in the rearview mirror, checking them, checking the baby, checking the traffic. And at a red light, he hit the steering wheel once, hard with the heel of his palm, and said something she'd never heard him say before. She looked at him. "Sorry," he said, and the light changed. He was afraid. She realized this with a shock of recognition. He was, for the first time in her experience of him, simply afraid, not for himself, but for the small person in the car seat who might be genuinely ill, who was 4 weeks old and couldn't tell anyone what was wrong, who was completely dependent on the 2 people who'd created her with considerably less planning than the situation warranted. They were the same. She was afraid too. She'd been afraid since the moment the fever appeared, and she recognized, with something complicated moving through her, that the fear in the car was shared, equally distributed, belonging to both of them. The NHS admitted them immediately. He presented credentials that made the process move very fast, which in this particular moment she chose not to feel conflicted about. A specialist arrived. The baby was examined with care. There were tests, a blood draw that made the baby scream in a way that made both of her parents go briefly still with the effort of not reacting, and a diagnosis, Acute upper respiratory infection, standard in newborns, manageable with treatment and monitoring. She'll need to stay overnight, the doctor said. We'll keep a close watch, bring the fever down, see how she responds. Ethan nodded. He was still holding the baby, had not relinquished her since they'd arrived. His suit jacket had been draped over a chair. He looked, in the fluorescent light of the pediatric ward, like a man who had been disassembled and put back together slightly differently. The night was long. The baby slept eventually, the fever coming down, her breathing steadying into something even and slow. Vivian sat in the hard plastic chair beside the crib and watched the IV drip and felt the accumulated weight of 4 weeks and 3 years and a divorce and a pregnancy and a phone call pressing down on her until she could barely keep her spine straight. Ethan was at the window. He'd been there for an hour, not quite looking at anything, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "I read your prenatal records." He said it the way someone admits something they know they shouldn't have done and couldn't help doing. The gestational diabetes risk, the anemia in the 3rd trimester, the breech presentation. He stopped. The postpartum mood assessment. The score was nearly the intervention threshold. She didn't say anything. "I looked at the intake forms from the hospital where she was born," he continued. "The field that says accompanying family member." He turned from the window. In the dim light, she could see the tiredness in his face, not the performed composure of a controlled person, but the genuine, exposed exhaustion of someone who has been sitting with a reckoning for hours and has no way to make it smaller. "Was there anyone?" he asked. "Was Lydia? She was on video call the whole night before, but not there. He was quiet for a moment. The monitors made their soft, rhythmic sounds. The baby breathed. "I need to ask you something," he said. He crossed the room and crouched down before her chair, bringing his face level with hers. This was extraordinary. She had never seen Ethan Wynne crouch in front of anyone. He put himself at a disadvantage for almost nothing. "Were you scared?" he asked. "The whole time, were you scared?" The question caught her somewhere unguarded, the specific spot that had been holding everything together. The place where the word scared lived alongside alone and tired, and I did this, and I would do it again, and it cost me more than I let anyone see. "Yes," she said, and her voice was barely there at all. He looked at her for a long time. "I'm not in a position to ask you to forgive me," he said. "I know that. I'm not asking." He looked at the crib, at the small sleeping face with the fever finally ebbing. "I'm only asking, if you can, for a chance to be in the room from now on, whatever that looks like, whatever you will allow." She didn't answer. The room was very quiet. "I missed everything," he said, and the words came out rough, like they'd been pulled from somewhere that wasn't used to releasing things. "I can't get that back. I know I can't." He paused. "I just don't want to miss anything else." She looked at her daughter sleeping in the crib, the tiny hand curled, the slow rise and fall, the face that was completely familiar and still daily surprising her. "Your coffee is cold," Vivian said. He blinked. "And you're sitting on a hospital floor in a $4,000 suit." She paused. "Which seems unnecessary." Something moved across his face, brief, uncertain, almost invisible. He got up and found the second plastic chair and pulled it to the other side of the crib, and he sat down, and he didn't say anything else, and neither did she, but he stayed. At some point in the early morning hours, she woke from a half-sleep to find that someone had draped his coat over her shoulders, and Ethan was sitting beside the crib with his head tipped slightly forward, fighting sleep, his hand through the crib slats loosely wrapped around 3 of the baby's fingers. She watched him for a long time. Then she closed her eyes again.
Part 3. The Year. The grandmother arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd month because the Nguyen family had a particular talent for arriving at moments when Vivian was least prepared. The woman was in her mid-70s, immaculate in silk and authority, silver-haired, walking with a carved ebony cane. She had attended Vivian and Ethan's wedding 3 years ago in a capacity that could best be described as ceremonially present and comprehensively unimpressed. She had never spoken to Vivian at any family gathering, though her gaze had occasionally passed over Vivian in the way that certain powerful people's gazes pass over furniture, registering and classifying without particular interest. Now she stood at the door of the small ivy-covered house and looked at Vivian and the baby with the expression of someone conducting an assessment. "You're Vivian Foe," she said, as if settling a question. "I am," Vivian said. "What brings you here?" "My great-granddaughter." Her gaze moved to the baby with an unhurried precision, and she stayed there for 3 full seconds. Then, as if having confirmed what she came to confirm, "Are you going to invite me in, or are we doing this on the porch?" Vivian stepped back. The grandmother moved through the house with the efficiency of someone documenting a space rather than experiencing it. She sat in the best chair as if it had been designated for her. She declined tea. She looked at Vivian across the room with that assessor's gaze and said, "The child's name. Her nickname is Nini. We haven't settled on a formal name." "Haven't settled?" Something in her expression said this was not acceptable. "This child carries the blood of this family. She should be in the family records. She should come home with us." She paused, softening the words slightly without actually changing them. "I came to take you both. The family home is appropriate. The ceremonies need to happen." There it was. Vivian had known it was coming. She'd prepared for it in the same way she'd prepared for other things, not by rehearsing speeches, but simply deciding, quietly and completely, what she would and wouldn't accept. "I think," Vivian said, "that my daughter is my daughter. Ethan and I are not married. We haven't finalized any custody arrangement. Until we have, decisions about where she lives, what ceremonies she attends, and what family records she's entered into are decisions I make." The grandmother's hand tightened on the cane. "You're a practical woman," she said, in the tone of someone who has decided to try a different approach. "Let me be practical. What can you give this child? Your resources are limited. Your family situation is complicated. The Nguyen family can offer her everything, the best education, complete security, a future she couldn't build for herself from the position she's in now." A pause. "And a family, a complete one. What I can give her is unconditional love and my complete presence. As for the rest, I trust that when she's old enough, she'll decide what kind of life she wants to live, not the kind her family chose for her." The silence in the room was dense. "Insolent," the grandmother said, and there was something almost like grudging respect in it. Then Ethan's voice came from the staircase. "My position on this is very clear." He came down the stairs in the quiet, deliberate way he had, not slowly exactly, but without any wasted motion. He was wearing dark slacks and a gray cashmere sweater, no tie,
and he looked at his grandmother with an expression Vivian had never seen him direct at a family member before. Respectful in form, immovable in substance.
Grandmother. He crossed the room and stood slightly in front of where Vivian was sitting, not blocking her exactly, but positioning himself between her and the conversation's momentum. Nini is my daughter and Vivian's. Everything about her, her name, her home, her future, will be decided by the two of us together, not by me alone and not by the family. His grandmother stared at him. Before either of us agrees to anything involving the family's ceremonies or records, Vivian's consent is required. Full stop. That's not a negotiating position. It's the only position I have. Ethan, the grandmother's voice had gone very still. You would put a woman who is no longer your wife, a woman who hid the existence of your child for 6 months, above the interests and traditions of your entire family. I would put my daughter's mother, he said quietly, in the position she deserves to be in, which is equal, yes. He said it without heat, without performance. He said it as if it was simply a fact he was communicating, and Vivian understood, watching him, that he had probably made this decision before she arrived and was simply executing it. The grandmother looked at Ethan for a long time, then at Vivian, then back at her grandson, and in her expression was something very complicated, anger certainly, and the specific species of grief that comes with watching someone you raised make a choice you can't control. Fine, she said. She stood. The cane struck the floor once, definitive. Very fine. You've made your choice clear. Remember it. She left without looking back. The door closed behind her, and the room was suddenly very quiet. Ethan didn't move for a moment. Then he turned to look at Vivian and asked, "Are you all right?" in the tone of someone who actually wants to know. She opened her mouth to say yes, automatically, the way she had said yes for years. But what came out instead was, "Why is it always now?" He went still. "That's all I want to know," she said, and her voice was smaller than she wanted it to be. "Why now? Why not 3 years ago or 2 years ago? Or why did you have to get to the edge of losing everything before?" She stopped. Her eyes were wet. She didn't bother fighting it this time. He crossed the room. He kneeled down, fully, uncomplicatedly kneeled, with no apparent concern of the indignity of it, so that he was looking up at her face. "I can't explain it in a way that makes sense. I can only tell you what happened." He held her gaze. "I looked at her face the night of the fever in the hospital, and I thought about you on the night she was born, alone, in that surgery room, and something—" He stopped. His voice was rough. "I couldn't pretend anymore that letting you go was the right thing, that the distance I'd been maintaining was noble, that you were better off without me." "Maybe you were," she said. "Maybe." He didn't look away. "But you're not required to be anymore. That's what I'm saying." He paused. "I know it's late. I know I have no right to ask. I'm asking anyway, because not asking is the other version of the same mistake." The baby, who had been asleep in the wrap against Vivian's chest through all of this, chose this moment to wake up. She didn't cry. She simply opened her eyes and regarded the situation with the vaguely skeptical expression of a person who has been roused from a good sleep to find adults in an emotional situation. She saw her father's face. She reached out and grabbed his finger. The particular grip of a very small person, the full hand, purposeful grasp of an infant who has decided that this particular thing is hers and she will not be releasing it, did something to Ethan's face that no boardroom success or family pressure or calculated choice ever had. His eyes went red at the corners. His jaw worked. He looked at his daughter holding his finger, and he made no attempt whatsoever to look like this wasn't affecting him.
Okay, Vivian said. He looked up. Clean up the eggs, she said, the ones you were hiding under the cabinet. A pause, a very slow, careful exhale. And next time, she said, use less heat and more oil, and maybe lower the ambitions slightly. A fried egg is not a wedding cake. He looked at her. Something in his eyes, relief maybe, or just something cautious and very warm, moved like light on water. Understood, he said. His voice was not quite steady. Complete egg-related notes taken. 12 months. The morning of the anniversary, Vivian woke to the smell of something burning. She lay still for a moment, listening. Below, in the kitchen, there were careful sounds, the soft thud of cabinet doors, the muted run of water, the quiet consultation between a man and an appliance manual. Underneath all of it, the particular liquid sound of Nini's early morning conversation with herself, the running commentary of a 1-year-old who has discovered that sounds are interesting and there is no reason to stop making them. She found the two of them in the kitchen in the aftermath of what was clearly had been a significant baking undertaking. Flour on the counter, flour on the floor, flour somehow on the ceiling. Several eggs in various states of completion occupied the space around the stove, and Nini was sitting in her high chair in her yellow birthday dress, banging a silicone spoon against the tray and making a sound that conveyed deep satisfaction. Ethan was wearing the cartoon egg apron. She still didn't know where he'd gotten it, and he had a smear of pink frosting on his chest, and he was staring at a pan of cookies that had, by the looks of them, declined to be heart-shaped despite his intentions. He heard her and turned. There was flour on his forehead. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was going to maintain dignity about this situation if it killed him. "Good morning," he said. "What happened?" "Baking," he said, with the precision of someone describing a natural disaster that was technically not their fault. "To the cookies?" They're abstract." Nini looked at her mother, then at the cookies, then back at her mother and said, "Bah! Bah!" pointing at Ethan with great enthusiasm and authority, as if it were very important that Vivian understood who was responsible for the cookies. Ethan, hearing his daughter say "bah, Dad," turned around with the expression of a person who had not yet fully adjusted to this being a thing that happened. His face did what it always did when Nini said that particular syllable, went very soft, very quickly, in a way he never seemed to notice. He'd been present the first time she said it, 3 weeks ago, completely unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary morning. He'd gone so still that Vivian thought something was wrong, and then she'd looked at his face and understood that he was simply trying very hard to stay in a moment he wasn't sure he deserved. She came the rest of the way down the stairs. On the table, 2 mugs of tea, eggs and toast, clearly from a second, more successful attempt or the efficient intervention of the housekeeper, and in the center of the table a plate of deeply irregular pink frosted cookies. On each, Ethan had used strawberries and blueberries to make shapes, some resembling M, some the number 1. Beside the plate was a handmade card. His handwriting, precise by habit, slightly labored in the way of someone writing something he'd rewritten several times, read, "1 year, to the best mother in any room she's ever been in, E and Nini." Vivian sat down. She picked up a cookie with an M. She bit into it. Ethan watched her from across the table. His hands were folded on the table surface in a posture of elaborate casualness that absolutely no one fooled.
The cookie was dense, slightly oversweetened. The icing was marginally too warm and had soaked into the top layer. It tasted, she thought, like effort and sleeplessness and the specific sincerity of someone who had never baked before in his life and had decided that this particular morning was worth trying. "Better than the eggs," she said, "from the beginning." He looked at her. The careful, contained quality of his expression could not quite contain what was underneath it, something bright and quiet and wholly unperformed. "Ba, ba," Nini said again, with great emphasis, holding up a chunk of toast in his direction. He reached over and took it and pretended to eat it, and Nini found this extremely satisfying and rewarded him with a full-faced laugh that left frosting on her cheek. He reached out and wiped it off with his thumb. The gesture was so automatic, so completely natural that neither of them remarked on it. Vivian held her tea in both hands and let the warmth come through the ceramic. Outside the window, the plane trees had come into new leaf. The morning was early and unhurried, full of small, ordinary sounds, the city waking up, birds in the trees, Nini's ongoing monologue, the low murmur of the refrigerator. "I thought," Ethan said conversationally, "that this afternoon we might go to that new children's sensory play center." He wasn't quite looking at her. "Apparently it's good for babies at this stage." "Who told you that?" "Research." A pause. Lydia also recommended it. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "We've reached a mutual understanding," he said. He still wasn't looking at her, and the particular quality of his casualness said that he was, in fact, quite proud of this development. "She stopped sending me threatening texts. I send her baby photos. It's a bilateral arrangement." Vivian took another sip of tea. "And if I want to go this afternoon?" Now he looked at her, directly, with the full attention that he'd spent 3 years being stingy with, and the last 12 months learning to offer without calculation. "Then we go, obviously." She set her mug down. She picked up one of the M-shaped cookies and held it out across the table. He leaned forward and bit into it, and a small crumb of frosting ended up at the corner of his mouth. And without thinking about it, without decision, her hand came up and her thumb brushed it away. The contact was brief, barely anything, just warmth against warmth, the ordinary casual intimacy of people who share a kitchen. He went very still for a moment. "Okay," she said, "we'll go." And that was all. No declaration, no promise, no vow made across a table in a house that still felt like it was learning to be a home. Just a Tuesday morning with burnt cookies and a laughing baby and 2 people sitting on opposite sides of a year that rearranged everything they thought they knew about themselves. Outside, the light was doing what it does in early spring, that particular golden quality that makes ordinary things look briefly like they've been chosen. It came through the windows and lay across the table and lit the cookies and the tea mugs and Nini's sticky hands and the corner of Ethan's expression that wasn't quite hidden by everything he was still learning to let be seen. Some things that break stay broken, and some things break open into something else entirely. Something you couldn't have designed on purpose, something that required the specific sequence of loss and stubbornness and fever and burnt eggs and a door kicked open in the middle of the night and a baby girl who grabbed her father's finger and refused to let go. Nini lifted her spoon, considered it, and brought it down on the tray with magnificent authority. The sound rang out through the kitchen, clear and bright, like a bell marking something. The story kept writing itself, quietly, in every ordinary morning, just like this one. She didn't plan to forgive him, she planned to survive him. And then somewhere between the burnt eggs and the fever and a baby who looked exactly like both of them, she realized that survival and forgiveness might be different paths to the same destination, and she was already most of the way there.
Thank you for watching the video. Please subscribe to the channel, like, comments, and share. See you again!